Welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at Shakespeare's publication, how these works went from Shakespeare's pen to the page that we read them off of. It's something of a complicated process because Shakespeare's involvement in publication was very limited. In fact, he was only really involved in some of his poetry, never really in the plays. This is mostly because the plays were actually the property of the theater group. And it wasn't popular in Shakespeare's day to actually write theater to be published in book form. Shakespeare's plays were meant to be performed, and meant to be seen. Not as many people read plays off of the page at that time. It was only at the very end of Shakespeare's life, and really a few years after his death, that such an act became popular. It's not to say that it wasn't done, because actually several of Shakespeare's plays were published during his lifetime, just not by Shakespeare. In fact, they were mostly copies that were published without permission, probably. Two of the most important terms to understand here are quartos and folios. These names have to do with the printing process. In this day, there was a fairly standard size sheet of paper that was used for printing. And once the print was arranged and put through the printing press, then that paper would be folded and cut to fit inside the book. So a quarto is folded, well, 4 times. So a folio was a much bigger and more complex, often more costly book. Quartos, on the other hand, were fairly cheap. During Shakespeare's day, several of his plays were published in quarto form, with varying degrees of quality. Where did these quartos come from if Shakespeare himself didn't publish them? Well, that's a complicated question. A lot of these quartos are what we call bad quartos, which contain really chopped up and adulterated versions of Shakespeare's plays. Some of these may have come from minor actors in the plays who decided to publish what they remembered of the play, and when they came across a speech that they didn't really know, they just kind of put it together and did the best they could, turning some of Shakespeare's greatest speeches into embarrassingly bad and short speeches. It's also possible that somebody took the prompt copy from the theater. The prompt copy is the official copy that the theater used during production. It often included the notes that the theater company would make in the margins to help them in their production process. It wasn't until after Shakespeare's death that many of his plays were compiled and officially published by a couple of his friends and fellow actors, John Hemminge and Henry Condell. This was in 1623, 7 years after his death. And they did it in their note to memorialize the great works of their friend Shakespeare. This was the first folio. It was a larger, more beautiful copy of Shakespeare's work, and it included 36 of his plays, although the table of contents actually only listed 35 of them. These were also divided into 3 genres: his comedies, his tragedies, and his histories. It wasn't until later that people began to separate a few of the plays into a category called romance. Plays that sort of defy the comedy and tragedy style, having the rich emotional depth of a tragedy while also tending to end in a more positive way, like a comedy. We'll talk more about that in my video over Shakespeare and genre. The most important play left out was Pericles, which is a play that Shakespeare co-wrote. It wasn't added until the 3rd folio was printed, and it wasn't even then added until the 2nd printing of the 3rd folio, in 1664. Of the folios, really the 1st folio is the most important. The later folios are mostly attempts to make more cash. Several other plays that are clearly not Shakespeare's were included under the name Shakespeare to try to maybe sell a few more plays. And unfortunately, these plays are very bad. So how can we be sure that we got the story as Shakespeare intended it? To help us through this, let's look at the different types of document. The first is the author's actual original manuscript, often called the foul copy. It's basically the rough writing in the author's hand. A second kind of document would be a fair scribal copy, which would be the consolidated manuscript written out by a scribe. Part of the process would be one of these copies being sent to the Master of Revels for censorship issues. Before the play could be put on, it had to be approved. The best document we have of this is the manuscript of Sir Thomas More, a play I'd like to talk about another time, which Shakespeare had a bit of a hand in writing, or at least revising, after it didn't pass censorship boards. Third is the prompt copy, the copy used by the theater during the production process. Other than the original manuscript, the scribal copies, and the prompt copies, there are 2 other kinds of documents that we get a whole lot of. There's a memorial text, which is when an actor or a group of actors write down what they remember of their lines after the fact. A lot of the quartos seem to be memorial texts. And there are also what we call reconstructed text, where people have taken multiple different versions of the play and put them together and tried to take the best bits of all of them and put them together to find what is most clearly the real thing. Although Himage and Condell, who compiled the first folio, warned against all those bad quartos, they clearly used some of the quartos as a base for their text. For a while it was thought that really the folio was the official version and all those quartos were bad, but it's not really true. The best Shakespeare scholars and editors today will usually take the folio to start with and then look through the better quartos and come up with the best text they can for you to read. You'll find, though, that if you buy several different copies of the same play, there may be minor differences. However, any good copy of the play will have footnotes and textual notes which will explain how the editors made those decisions. A great example of this is in the first soliloquy in Hamlet, when Hamlet says, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew." Some of them say, "Oh, that this too sullied flesh." Is it solid, or is it sullied? Well, both make a kind of sense here. My flesh is solid, but I want it to just melt away. Or my flesh is sullied, as in dirtied. Hamlet definitely does feel unclean in this, watching everything unfold, and he's angry at himself. His self-loathing is abundantly apparent throughout this soliloquy as well as the others. So either word makes sense here. It's up to the editor to decide which one feels the most right. There are also other nuances, as in the fact that Shakespeare may very well have adjusted his plays throughout the performance process. Shakespeare had several excellent actors in his troupe, notably Richard Burbage, and there were times when Shakespeare clearly was writing a role for Burbage. And it's even possible that he adjusted the roles at times after they had already been written to fit a particular actor better. Therefore, there may be one quarto that has one line, and then another quarto that has another. Both of them may have been what Shakespeare wrote, he was just making adjustments. However, we have a lot of confidence in Shakespeare's longer poems, especially Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, both of which were published with Shakespeare's clear involvement. So can you be sure you're reading what Shakespeare really wrote? Well, not perfectly, but you can have a lot of confidence in some of the excellent scholars, such as the Folger Library or the Oxford Shakespeare editions. People dedicate their lives to making sure you get the best copy of Shakespeare you can get. Most of these editions will also make editorial choices to just make it easier for you to read, like updating and clarifying some of the spellings. In Shakespeare's day, people didn't always spell the same word the same every single time they used it. So if you're interested in this, it's worth reading those introductions in those books of Shakespeare that you've got. Certainly your editors are going to talk to you a little bit about how they put this book together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time when we talk about Shakespeare and genre.